Welcome, everybody. This is Getting Started on Your Farm Succession Plan, and I am Joy Kirkpatrick, and I'm the Farm Succession Outreach Specialist for the UW-Madison Division of Extension. Welcome to Getting Started on Your Farm Succession Plan. While we're getting started, I want to point out some of the web features that we'll be using today. We'll be using the Q&A, so if you have questions, please share those. I believe we have it set up that if you see a question that you would like answered or have a similar question, you can sort of upvote that. So that helps us know which ones we may want to prioritize. So put your questions in the Q&A, and then anything else that you want to share, you can put into the chat. We have some of my colleagues who you can see right now are going to be helping us monitor both the question and also the chat. And if you're just joining us, if you want to put in the chat your state, city, state, and if you're in Wisconsin, the county, that would be great. And the other thing that I also wanted to point out is that it might be helpful for you to have some scratch paper and a pen or pencil handy during the presentation. While we're not going to make you work extra hard, there are a few things that we'd like you to write down for your own purposes. I want to introduce our team here. I want to introduce you to my Extension Farm Management colleagues. We have here on the upper left, Tricia Wagner is our program manager and fearless leader. Katie Wantock covers financial management and areas of risk, including taxation, crop insurance, and grain marketing. She currently has the Farm Pulse online farm financial management course and a hybrid grain marketing course. Both of these are enrolling if you're interested. Steph Plaster works in agricultural business development and entrepreneurship. She has a series called Getting Started with Your Food or Farm Business. I'm currently working with her on 2 courses, Cultivating Your Farm's Future, which we'll talk more about later, and Navigating Your Ag Business from Stress to Success. Both of those are also currently enrolling and have spots open. And they begin in January. Jim Verswevel is our labor and safety specialist. He runs the Youth Tractor Safety Program and has an online Becoming the Employer of Choice course available, which covers workplace culture, leadership, and employee development. He has one of those Becoming Employer of Choice classes starting soon. Leonard Polzine in the lower left is our dairy markets and policy specialist. He covers dairy market conditions, price outlook, and future market expectations. He also works with federal milk marketing orders and the evolving structure of the farm and processing sector. Ganu Tao is our Hmong farmer outreach specialist. She runs a social media group for Hmong farmers and community members and works with our team to provide culturally and linguistically accessible materials to Hmong farmers. And finally, we have Kelly Wilford, our newest specialist. She is currently developing her program on legal risk, which will likely cover land and leasing access, long-term care and estate planning, and farm succession business entities and taxation. Another colleague who isn't on this slide, and I want to acknowledge as part of the team for today's webinar, is Caitlin Davis. She's the Agriculture Outreach Specialist for Extension, and she works on answering all kinds of agricultural questions that come through the county extension offices throughout the state. She's also was my partner in some recent farm succession research that we're going to talk a little bit about later in this presentation. So here's where we want to have your paper and pen ready to go. My question to you is, I'd like you to think about your motivation for joining this webinar, or what's motivating you to think about succession planning. Jot them down on your paper. I'm just going to give you maybe a minute to do that, thinking about what's your motivation and what's motivating you to think about succession planning. And while you're doing that, I will check into the chat just to see where people are from. Okay. If you're willing to share in the chat some brief comments or words about your motivation, please do so. We'd like to make this, I know this is a webinar, so you can't see anybody else. You can only see me and my slides, but we want to make this as interactive as possible. So if you're willing to share in the chat some brief comments or words about your motivation, please do. Don't feel obligated. Some of the motivations can be deeply personal, but I want you to think about your motivations for farm succession and have those reasons clearly in your mind. These reasons are things that you can come back to when you might lose motivation to work on your plan, or and maybe run into some things that might be a little challenging. Thank you for those of you who are putting those motivations into the chat. I appreciate that. You can continue doing that if you'd like. One of the motivations that we think about when we're working with farms, and especially when we're encouraging them to do some work on their planning, their farm succession planning, is that universal motivator, and that's saving money. Who doesn't like to save money, right? What we wanted to share with you today, what I'm going to share with you today is some action steps that you can take that can save you time and money when you start working with service professionals on your succession plan. I will say that these action steps and recommendations are not going to be earth-shatteringly new ideas. They are practical things you can start working on today. I've asked you to think and write down your motivation for working on your succession plan. And I've given you that carrot that if you work on some of these action steps, you can save some time and money. But let's think about now, what are the things you haven't started on? Why you haven't started on succession planning? You've got motivation. You may even have written several reasons down for why you want to do this. So what's keeping you from working on a plan? So what are your barriers to farm succession? There's been some work, there's been lots of work around succession planning, business succession planning, family business succession planning. And there's a big body of work about that when we think about family businesses, and not necessarily a farm, right? All kinds of family businesses. And there's been some work done, and a book was published, The Succession Conspiracy by Ivan Landsberg. And here's some things that was noted with the barriers to business succession planning. And you guys might all recognize some of these, right? Raises unpleasant family issues, forces people to confront their mortality, the inability to choose among children or make those decisions on distribution of assets, too busy doing day-to-day tasks to put the time to it. There may be a loss of control, a loss of identity for that owner generation. They may be too dependent on the assets for their later years' expenses. Some people think that planning reduces their options. We might want to challenge that a little bit. And some people say that they don't know how to start the process. Maybe some others that we could include in this list are no one in the family wants to take over the business, or finding an unrelated successor can be challenging if there isn't one coming up from the family. So what happens is that these various barriers can kind of tamp down that motivation and lead businesses to select the least logical, most costly, and most destructive, but a lot of times the most popular option. And that's called the do nothing strategy. A lot of times what people think about is that they're avoiding discomfort now for more issues that they'll have to address later. I just mentioned a list of reasons that business owners avoid succession planning, and that list was from a book from 1988, right? So, and that list wasn't farm specific, and not much has changed for barriers over the years. We do have some research that is farm specific that we want to share. So in 2017, we talked to groups of farmers about farm succession planning. When we asked about their barriers to planning, these were the most common answers. So we'll start at the top. One of them is that the perception that service professionals don't understand agriculture. We'll talk a little bit more about that in some later slides, but that was one of the top barriers. The other one is the financial capacity of the farm and increasing land values. And again, we'll talk about that in just another slide or two. Don't know how to start. That was something from that 1988 book. Too busy and it's easy to put off. Again, that's kind of a universal thing. And then that last one is communications, fair versus equal, resistance to change, and loss of control. Let's unpack that last one on this slide a little bit. The little icon is of people. I chose that one to represent the communication and relationships tensions the farmers mentioned. Researchers from Pennsylvania, the research led by Dr. Maggie Pitts, used the word tensions to describe these rather than issues, challenges, or conflicts. I like tensions. I think it's a slightly more neutral word to use for these topics. And when we think about it, we're all human, we all have emotions. So why act like these aren't real or they're not there? No family's perfect. So let's normalize that these tensions are common in succession planning and talk about ways to address them. I'm going to launch a poll here. If I can find them. And I'm going to launch the barriers to farm succession. What I'd like you to do is take a look at these. I think there are two questions. One is you can select any of those there. If you can click on the ones that you feel like are there. I just want to check and make sure people are seeing. Oh, yep, people are seeing the polls. And then there's the second question is, if short answer, do you have a barrier that isn't in the list above? And you can type it here. And I do know that we have several professionals who work with farms. And so while you may not be answering, we'd like you to answer those polls too. So even if you don't have a farm, what do you see as being some of the barriers when you do work with those farms? I'll leave that poll open just for a few more seconds. We've got about 33% of you that have participated. When we get to over half, I will in the slide here. Okay. Looks like we've got most of you who've answered the poll. So I'm going to end that poll. I am going to share the results very quickly. Looks like fair versus equal inheritance is a big one for this group. But you've kind of hit on all of them a little bit, but that fair versus equal is something that you have there. All right, thank you for participating in that poll. And we will have a couple others to kind of break up the webinar today. So I appreciate you participating in that. Now let's talk a little bit about that financial capacity of the farm and increasing land values. So it's rare for a farm not to have concerns about the financial capacity of the farm and those increasing land values. Profit margins are narrowing. Inflation has been an issue for the past year or two. And to control inflation, we're seeing interest rates go up to numbers that we haven't seen in decades. So when we look at this particular slide that I have on the screen right now, it's from the USDA National Ag Statistics Service, and it's the most recent data that we have, which came out in August of 2023, August of this year. And I'm going to kind of focus in on this upper Midwest because that's, that's where this webinar is coming from, Wisconsin. And looking at the numbers are the the average value of the farmland real estate value by state. So in Wisconsin, the average is 6,200. Obviously, we know that there are places that have a higher per acre value in the state, but this is that average. Then that percentage is looking at the increase, the dollar per acre and percent change from just the previous year. So for us, it was a positive 8.8%. And when you think about what that means, and if you were to look at the numbers over a series of years from say like 2025 until or 20 until 2005 until this year, it's just continually has been increasing when we think about that, right? It's over the years it has built. So for farmers who've maybe purchased in maybe the 70s, maybe the 80s, and then to see this continually rise, right? We're seeing those land values rise. So then the question is, as owners of this big asset, how can farmers realize this increased value in their biggest asset? They either have to sell it at full market value, or they can use it as leverage to borrow to increase their assets, right? More cows, land, new enterprises that will make them additional income, right? The plan is that you grow. That first one, where they have selling it at full market value, is unattainable, just to be quite honest, for beginning farmers to pay in so many cases. And then that second option of borrowing against the owner's equity to continue growing is not always appealing either, especially as those owners get to a point where they're maybe wanting to pull some of the assets to make it more liquid or accessible. So when we think about this land, these assets, the question that I always talk with farms when I'm meeting with them, it comes down to basically this next question that we talk through. And that's, what do farm families want these assets to be? This is what I call the 3 buckets answer to the question, right? We've got 3 buckets. That first one that we have is retirement assets. Now, first, before I lose half of you because of this dirty word on the screen, I want to acknowledge that the word retirement is not one that farmers may use for themselves. We know this, but can we at least acknowledge that there is a need for everyone to plan for their later in life financial needs? My point is that for a lot of farms I work with, the assets are needed, at least partially, to support the owner throughout the rest of their lives. So if you don't like the retirement word, let's call that bucket income generating assets for the owner's future, right? But that just doesn't roll off the tongue like retirement assets. So you can use either one of those that you'd like. Let's talk about this a little bit more. For many farmers, that farm is their retirement plan. I have had farmers say, the farm is my retirement plan. They reinvest any profits that they can back into their business to grow, improve, modernize. So they may not have that extra cash to invest into an IRA or other type of retirement plan. And farmers are, if anything, excellent tax managers. So they may prepay a lot of expenses at the end of the year, maybe strategically sell inventories and take advantage of depreciation opportunities so that they do not report a lot of income. Therefore, they may not have paid a lot into Social Security. For these reasons, the farm has to be their retirement plan. They need to either sell the assets or stay in the business to provide for their later years. That next one is that the business assets. If they have a successor and a successor has been identified and maybe they've already heavily committed to the business, those same assets are most likely necessary for them to continue that business the way it's been running. And then finally, when we think about that, it's the inheritance. The last box is that inheritance. For many families, there's an expectation that these same assets are going to be inheritance assets. And the question is, can it be all 3 things? And if there's still debt on the farm, that makes it even more difficult to think about how you distribute those assets across among those three buckets. By this time, some of you are probably saying, I know all this, Joy, I live it, right? Where are these time and money saving actions that I've promised you? Well, I'll say that we're getting there. We're going to do something. We're going to have a little activity next. And you're going to probably ask why I'm asking you to do this, but we'll get to that too. So one thing that you can do is write and rehearse your elevator pitch for your farm. An elevator pitch is a concise, clear, and consistent description of your farm as it is currently being managed. I want you to think about introducing yourself to someone who who understands the business of farming, but doesn't know you or your farm. Can you describe your farm in 1 to 2 minutes? You might include who you are and who is a part of the farm, what you grow, raise, do, and how big your farm is, and how do you sell your products. We're going to give you about a minute and a half to jot down your answers to these questions and drop it into chat if you'd like, but I'd really like you to practice that. I think I'm going to try to drop those questions into the chat so that you can see them. So I've put those into the chat: who you are and who is a part of the farm, what you grow, raise, do, how big your farm is, and how do you sell your products. So think about how you would answer that and give your 1 to 2 minute elevator speech. If you want to drop that in, if you have it devised and you want to drop it into the chat, we'd love to hear some of those elevator speeches. Okay, I'm going to move forward because I want to get to a few other things before we open it up for questions. But I want to point out, if this question put you on the spot, so to speak, we're going to share a few worksheets from Cultivating Your Farm's Future. It's a workbook for farm succession planning in Wisconsin that can help you organize this information. From those answers from that worksheets, you can distill it down to your elevator speech. So why am I suggesting this as one of the action steps? So this action step that I'm recommending goes back to one of those barriers that were identified by the farmers that we spoke to in 2017. And that was that ag service professionals working in farm succession don't understand agriculture. So when we think about the service professionals around farm succession, maybe they're attorneys, they're accountants, tax specialists, financial planners. But let's think about that for a minute. Those attorneys and accountants and other similar service providers work with a lot of different businesses. They can't possibly know all the details of those industries, but they do know law. They know business entities, estate planning, tax rules, and investment strategies. It should be your job to tell them about your business. So we recently conducted 15 interviews with service professionals to ask them what they'd like farms to do before they come meet with them. And what they said was, these were the common answers from that. Before their meeting with ag professionals, farm owners should have basic information about their farms, which should include that information about assets, the family tree, and family history. Now, I put that history piece at the end because for a lot of farms, when we ask about the farm, they will talk a lot about that history. And I think that's important. It definitely shows a value of wanting to keep it in the family. But we kind of get sometimes deep into the weeds of the history. And these ag professionals also need to know quite a bit about how that farm is running, how your business is running now, so that they know like who the players are, what the assets are. So make sure that when you think about that elevator speech, if that history is important, include it, but also don't let it take over that entire 2 minutes of your elevator speech. Ag service professionals also advise people to have that idea of like being able to present your business so that you have it in a way that's, as I said, clear, concise, and consistent, because you may be going to several of those professionals and you want to make sure that you're giving them all the same story and all the same details so that it doesn't get confused when they start giving you ideas or options. We also want to think about those financial records that are complete and up to date, because there's, that's that component of financial analysis. So making sure that you gather basic information, have that elevator pitch ready to go, and then financial records are complete. And then the other piece is write down your questions before meeting. That may sound simple, but you really need to have spent some time ahead of going to those professionals thinking about these things, and that may help you think about the questions that you need to ask and then write those down, because once you get into that meeting, it can, you may forget some of those. So thinking about all of doing these things to have an efficient meeting, which efficient usually means less expensive. Then we asked, the other question that we asked those professionals is, when you work with farms, what do you see as reasons or factors of success? And these are the things that they talked about a lot. That good communication between the owners and successors, and what does that look like, right? For transitions between family, for example, you may want to focus on changing those work-related conversations from a parent-child dynamic or pattern to more of an employer-employee when it's about the business, right? When they first start, maybe they're coming in as an employee. Then you might be working on building that to a partnership dynamic. Now, that's easy for me to say. I'm not related to you. You may already have been working together as co-managers. So if that communication pattern hasn't been addressed, it will take some intentional work to change those patterns. And it's so easy to fall back into that communication pattern you're used to and comfortable with when there's a conflict or there's stress. And we all know how much conflict and stress happens on farms, right? So being intentional and changing how you talk to each other is a key takeaway. And we're going to share some resources to help you maybe start building those meeting conversations and agendas to have those better conversations. The other one is having a good idea of your vision and goals. I know what you're thinking about this one. Those words, vision and goals, sound suspiciously like strategic planning. And yes, they are. I'm not going to sugarcoat the fact for those service professionals to do a good job for you, you have to tell them what you want and what you want to have happen. Now, that's not saying that they will be able to write an ironclad succession plan to give you all those things. Things change. As I've said, there are humans involved, but knowing the end goal or goals help you and the professionals winnow down the options to consider. And again, I will share worksheets from the workbook. One of them is called What Does Your Future Look Like? That can help you think about what you want in a 3 and 5 year time frame. You can change those time frames if you want, but I found those work best for most. 10 years maybe feel too far down the road to really think about what you want to have happen. And 1 year is maybe not enough time for some changes to take place. So thinking about what you want in 3 and 5 years can be helpful. The other piece is having good financials and off-farm income, right? When you think about, in the previous slide, I talked about having those financials to be able to do that analysis. Now, this is thinking about, does the farm have the financial capacity to do what you're asking it to do? And let's just be honest, in so many farms in Wisconsin, off-farm income right now is the way that succession and the way the business is being kept a business, and also the way succession happens. When we think about that gradual transfer of ownership, that's really important, thinking about over a period of time, giving that opportunity for that successor to build management skills and develop some of that, develop some of those skills. And then to kind of partnered with that, thinking about building those skills, there's that trust built up between both parties, right? You have to have some level of trust that that successor is capable, and that the owner generation is willing to make that transition. So there's two-way street for that trust. And then finally, that having had some conversations and have a plan, that that fair is not always an equal inheritance distribution. Really thinking about what if an equal, what an equal inheritance distribution may place, what burden it may place on that on-farm heir to be able to buy out siblings. In some cases, some of these factors of success and having to discuss them with your family and farming partners might feel like you're actually acknowledging that elephant in the room. And not only is that elephant in the room, once you start talking about some of these tensions, remember we're calling them tensions and every farm has them, that elephant has a seat at the table. So when you get to this point, I describe that as farms kind of being in that messy middle. So this image shows a cord or a wire that's a big mess on the left side, but as you move to the right, that big mess starts working itself into a smaller and smaller jumble until you have this light bulb. So if you feel like that jumble on the left when you start talking about farm succession, I just want to talk about, don't panic, right? That messy middle, we've talked about your motivation to start planning. We want to keep those in mind. We want you to talk about those barriers. And those barriers or tensions feed into this messy middle concept. Excuse me. It can be frustrating to start the conversation and then realize you're in that jumble of cords. You're in your own messy middle. But here's the thing. You're going to be uncomfortable doing some of this. I encourage you to find a way to sit with that uncomfortableness, because you don't grow or change. And I call succession something I call that big change, when you stay in your comfort zone. So I encourage you to acknowledge that you're in the messy middle. Now that you have a name for it, right? That uncomfortable feeling. Resist the urge to go back to the familiar and into your comfort zone, right? I've seen that lots of times. Farm families kind of get to a point where that's something that they really don't feel comfortable talking about. And so they just kind of step back and keep farming, do that do nothing strategy. I want you to resist that urge. And please don't skip over that messy middle. I've also seen that where they run into something that's a little bit, they have a barrier or tension going on, and they kind of jump over that messy middle, put some plans together, right? You risk putting together a plan that doesn't work for anyone. And you may leave some great ideas behind because you haven't taken the time to learn what others are thinking. We've used a framework that can help you sort through some of your messy middle. And we use this framework for our workbook, Cultivating Your Farm's Future, and for our workshop series that uses the same name. That framework is what we call that 3-step process. So we go through the workbook as well as in our workshop series, where's the farm now? This is that data gathering that we discussed earlier, having a good description written down about the who of the farm, the what of the farm, the enterprises, the acres, facilities, in what condition are the facilities, and that financial performance and position of the farm. That second part is that where do you want to be? That's where you discuss those goals. Sometimes we call them intentions instead of goals. That word seems to sit better with farmers. And the visions, right? We talked about that 3 and 5 years vision of all involved. And then how do you get there? That is where you definitely want to bring in the professionals. You can provide them with a great picture of where the farm is now and where you'd like to be with your intentions and visions. And then they can help you with ideas of how to get there. And these ideas can be more specific to your needs because you've taken the time to present your farm and goals. The attorneys don't have to give you a laundry list of options. They can give you a more thoughtful list of options. So at this point, with this slide, I want to speak specifically to the owners in our group today. You will determine the path of whatever happens to this farm. You know that old adage of the golden rule? Whoever holds the gold makes the rules. So if the owner generation still owns most of the assets, they are still in control of what happens. You have to make the effort to include the successor into the decision making and not assume if they want it, they need to step up. Yes, the successor needs to build skills and find a way to contribute meaningfully to the business, but owners need to give them direction. Do they need to get an education or work somewhere else before they come back to the farm? Do they need to show how they will save the farm money or make the farm money? You need to tell them this and give them what they're shooting for and what they need to do to be able to come back to the farm. You determine the path, and you need to consider what your needs are in your later years. If you don't have a successor identified, you still need to make decisions. You have to work harder maybe to find a successor if there isn't one coming up through the family. But in both cases, with or without an identified successor, you need to plan for the retirement or later years and have an estate plan. So this is a gentle kick in the pants to get moving on something in 2024. What we want to talk about here, so we've kind of I'm going to hit the high points and just remind you what we've talked about. The key takeaways: build and practice your elevator speech. Think about your 3 buckets, right? Those retirement assets, the business assets, and inheritance assets. And then the other one is talk to each other. We have some resources. We're going to send some key worksheets in a follow-up email. So all of the resources that I've mentioned here today, we're going to send it all in an email so that way you have everything in one place. The goal of this webinar was to provide some key actions and resources to get you started. If this webinar and the resources I send you jumpstart your planning and get you on your way, that's great. We've accomplished something. If, however, you think you've benefit from meeting with others who are working on their succession plan and with a group of extension educators to help facilitate conversations, we are offering a 4-week series that is based on the 3-step process and the workbook that I've mentioned. We have 2 options. One is during the day on Wednesdays from noon to 1:30, virtual options, and then Thursday evenings from 6 to 7:30. Again, a separate virtual option. Same content, just different times. The cost is $100 per family, and you can have as many people from your farm attend. Those start the last part of January and first part of February. So I know that you're coming up to a time where families will be gathering for the holidays and this webinar has motivated you, but please consider if this is the best time to have that business conversation. That is one thing that I encourage farms that I work with one-on-one is thinking about how do you sort of pull out family and business, right? So having a farm business conversation with everybody there might not be the best option. I encourage neutral locations, having an agenda and the right people at the table, which may mean that not everybody at your holiday table needs to be at those first meetings. I do want to share one more poll, and I think we can start opening it up. I don't know if, Steph, if there are any questions that have come up.
I have not seen any questions come in.
Okay, I'm going to put together, I'm going to launch a poll for future topics. So there are 3 questions. What are farm succession topics you'd like to learn more about? And again, you can pick any and all. And if there's something that's not on the list, there's a short answer area, and then there's the mode of delivery. You can rank how you'd like to have those delivered. So I'm going to have you guys work on those. And I do have a few, I'm going to stop sharing just for a second, I think. Let me see if my last slide. Yeah, the last slide is just questions. So I'm going to stop sharing that so that I can at least see my cohorts here. Start working on those future topics. I'm going to drop in a few links into the chat. Here's a link to that workshop that I just mentioned. If you're interested, it will be coming out in the email as well. I'd like you guys to keep working on the poll. All right, there was one pre-submitted question, and I'm going to try to answer that while you guys are finishing this poll. So the question was, I better find it so I read it correctly.
Joy, I can read it for you if you'd like.
Yes, that'd be great. Thank you, Kelly.
Absolutely. So the question was, our farm succession would be to someone outside of the family. What are the advantages and disadvantages of owner financed options rather than outright sale? How do you know when to start making contacts and concrete plans for succession to someone who's unrelated?
Great. Thanks, Kelly. And I'm going to also say Kelly can jump in if she'd like to help me answer that. I'm going to stop the poll. So when we think about farmer owner financed, if you're thinking about a true sort of like contract or installment sale where the owner is stepping away from management, right? Some of the things you think about is that one thing is that the owner would be the bank and they would get the interest on that installment, on those payments, rather than the successor going to a bank and borrowing it at the bank's interest rate. Maybe there's a negotiated lower interest rate. So an advantage for the successor is that they maybe get a lower interest rate. For the owner, they're getting that interest rather than the bank getting it. Then the other pieces of that are it may be easier for that successor to start buying it if that instead of having to go to a commercial lender. I would encourage, though, that the owner make sure that the successor is financially in a place that they can make those payments, right? Having the same sort of documents and evaluation that a lender would have would be an important piece. If some of the disadvantages is if the buyer defaults, they would not have opportunity to have access to any of the equity they may have built up in that farm, right? Usually it goes, the asset goes back to the owner if the buyer defaults in a land contract. So the other thing is if the seller is willing to do what's necessary if the buyer starts defaulting on that contract. There may be some tax advantages for the owner if they sell over time. So there are a few things to consider with that. If it's something where you're going to be working with that successor or that beginning farmer for a while, and you're in some sort of joint venture, that may be a different conversation than the land contract. And then the question about timeline and contracts, I think, again, thinking about what we offered in the webinar of making sure that you know what you want from it financially, and also what you want it to look like, right? If you have some parameters that you really want it to stay a farm, you want it to, if there's some non-financial things that you also want to consider with that, making sure that you know what you want before you start offering out this opportunity, so that there aren't some false starts, and making sure that the other thing that I would suggest is, and we didn't talk about this one at all, especially within non-related parties, I think it's really helpful to think about what your values are for each of the parties, thinking about what it is that is bringing you to the table and what that you can work on. Like, are there values that you can build on that you share together? I think the values work is important for all of them, but
Joy, can I jump in and add a few things
yeah,
quickly?
sure.
So for those of you that have maybe been on some of Joy and Extension's webinars before, I'm sort of a new face to the bunch with legal risk. So some background, I actually am an attorney with the disclaimer that any information I provide is for educational purposes only. And I'm not your attorney. I can't be your attorney. But as we talk about the question of transitioning to a non-family member potentially, Joy talks a lot about figuring out the financials, and I just want to hammer home how important that is. So it's not only what do you and the retiring generation want, perhaps, but also what do you need? We've got some great worksheets available, and maybe they'll be in the resources Joy will send out to figure out what are some of your monthly living expenses, what type of dollar amount or savings do you need to have if you might end up in a nursing home. Is our farm assets going to pay for that, or do we need to come up with a plan for a nursing home to pay for that? So there are some great resources out there for that. And then it's sort of secondary to figure out, okay, once I always encourage people, take care of you first. Put your own, just like on a plane, put your own oxygen mask on first. And then once we figure out that, then we jump to the farm side of things. So some more of those specifics around how are we going to transfer it? Who are we going to transfer it to? What limitations might we be able to put on there based on what your particular interests are? And I think a lot about, as we talk about the context that you might be looking at for a potential successor, you might already have folks around you, younger farmers who might be interested, neighbors who might be interested, who maybe haven't even directly made that connection. I would always encourage you, figure out first, what do I need to get out of the farm? What do I feel comfortable that I will be financially secure for myself? And then don't hesitate to start talking to a few people. Avoid making promises. Don't feel like you have to put it in paper, but start to see, does my expectation of what I think I should get out of the farm line up with what someone else can realistically afford, or what that fair market value maybe is. But don't be afraid to talk to a few different people. Your bankers and financial advisors would be other great folks who might have ideas on that front because they know your financials.
Thank you, Kelly. I am going to open it up again, and whether you put it in the Q&A or the chat, if you have other questions. I do see one in the chat about minor children. What's the best path to forming succession for them? I think one thing is making sure that, having minor children means as having a plan that also takes care of them if something were to happen to the parents while they're still minors. So there's that to think about. Identifying someone that can help, be a guardian, or thinking about guardians for them. Also thinking about who could manage or maybe take care of the farm until they're a point. Let's hope that that doesn't happen. Kelly?
Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry to pop in and out.
Yeah.
I was just going to add, the other thing to think about too is that succession planning and estate planning in the legal space, we really strongly encourage people reconsider those plans every 3 to 5 years, because the plan that's right for you when your children are minors is not going to be the same plan that is right for all of you by the time that they're 20 or 30.
Yeah.
And you're going to know more about their personalities and their interests as they age, what they can be trusted with. Really, with those minor children, it's thinking about how do we set them up for success at the age they're at if something happens to you tomorrow, but also with a plan that will now cover you for the next 5 or 10 years or whatever it is.
There have been so many farms that I've worked with that their most recent will is either named guardian for the person who's actually in the business now, or they don't even have children named who were born after the will was made. So I agree with that. The other part is making sure that you like the financial component of making sure that farm is financially sound and you have the ability to bring that into, so that you have the ability to bring those successors in. And then I have suggest that you talk about like writing a letter or somehow documenting what are your expectations of the children if they want to come back to the farm. I mentioned, do they need to go to school? Do they need to work someplace else? What is it that you want them to bring to the table? Talking about that even when they're young helps them think about what they might need to do when they're in high school, when they're right out of high school, so that they're best set up for success to come back with the skills that that are best for the farm. So thinking about that. And I see that Kelly is answering some in the chat. So if you can take a look at those, you can do that. It is 12:52. I am going to stop the recording, and I want to thank everybody for hanging on. I appreciate you participating. I'll look for an email from me next week with some of these resources. And if you have any questions, you can respond directly to that email. And thank you for joining.